October 30th, 1944, the Vosges Mountains of France. Over 200 American soldiers were trapped behind German lines, surrounded, cut off from supplies, water, and hope. They had been there for 6 days. The wounded were dying. Ammunition was running out. Every attempt to reach them had failed. 30 miles away, another group of American soldiers prepared to try again. They were men of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Their families were behind barbed wire in internment camps back home in America. Their government had taken their businesses, their homes, their freedom, called them security risks, because of the color of their skin and the shape of their eyes. But these Japanese American soldiers, these Nisei, were about to attempt what no other unit could accomplish. They were going to march into some of the most brutal terrain in Europe, break through German defenses that had held for weeks, and bring their fellow Americans home. The mission would cost them dearly. In 5 days of fighting through dense forest and entrenched positions, the 442nd would suffer over 800 casualties, more casualties than the number of men they were sent to rescue. This is not a story about victory in the traditional sense. This is a story about the cost of proving your loyalty, when your loyalty should never have been questioned. About men who fought not just against an enemy army, but against the prejudice of their own country, about a rescue mission that would define what it meant to be American. This is the story of the Lost Battalion of the Vosges, and the men who refused to leave anyone behind. Daniel Inouye was 17 years old when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1940-1. He was a senior at McKinley High School in Honolulu, Hawaii. That Sunday morning, he was getting ready for church when he heard the explosions. He ran outside and saw the planes, the red circles on their wings, the smoke rising from the harbor. His first thought, according to his later testimony, was simple and devastating. We're at war, and people are going to look at us differently now. He was right. Within months, Japanese Americans on the West Coast, over 120,000 men, women, and children were forced from their homes and sent to internment camps. It didn't matter if they were citizens. It didn't matter if they'd been born in America. The government declared them potential enemies based solely on their ancestry. Executive Order 966 was signed by President Franklin Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, just 73 days after Pearl Harbor. The order gave military commanders the authority to exclude any persons from designated areas. It didn't mention Japanese Americans by name. It didn't have to. Everyone knew who it was targeting. Families lost everything. Businesses closed overnight. Homes were sold for pennies on the dollar or simply abandoned. A produce farmer in California who'd spent 20 years building his business had to sell it for a fraction of its value. A shopkeeper in Seattle locked his doors and never reopened. A florist in Los Angeles left behind greenhouses full of orchids that died untended. They were given days, sometimes only hours, to pack what they could carry and report to assembly centers. 1 suitcase per person, maybe 2 if they were lucky. Everything else had to be left behind or sold in desperation, from assembly centers, fairgrounds, racetracks, anywhere that could hold large numbers of people temporarily. They were transported to camps in remote areas. Manzanar in California, Hard Mountain in Wyoming, Topaz in Utah, Minidoka in Idaho, Gila River in Arizona, Jerome and Rower in Arkansas, Jewel Lake and Poston and Grenada. 10 camps in total, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, machine guns pointed inward. The official term was relocation centers, but everyone knew what they were: prison camps. The barracks were hastily built, tar paper over wooden frames, no insulation in summer. The heat was unbearable. In winter, wind and snow blew through the cracks. Families shared single rooms with no privacy, communal bathrooms, communal mess halls. Every aspect of life controlled and monitored. Many of those in prison had sons of military age. Young men who had been born in America, who had grown up playing baseball and going to movies and dreaming American dreams, who were American in every way that mattered. And now their families were behind barbed wire while their government debated whether they could be trusted. In Hawaii, where Japanese Americans made up nearly 40% of the population, mass internment wasn't practical. The island's economy would have collapsed, but suspicion and discrimination were everywhere. Young men like Daniel Inouye felt it in the stares, the questions, the doubt. Japanese language schools were closed. Buddhist temples were raided. Community leaders were arrested and held without charges. Fishermen had their boats confiscated. Anyone who had traveled to Japan even decades earlier was suspect. Daniel Inoue worked as a medical aide at an aid station after Pearl Harbor. He saw wounded soldiers coming from the harbor. He helped however he could. He wanted to enlist, to fight for his country, but the Army classified Japanese Americans as 4C, enemy aliens, ineligible for service. It didn't matter that he was an American citizen. It didn't matter that he'd been born in Honolulu, raised speaking English, pledging allegiance to the flag every morning at school. The color of his skin and his Japanese ancestry made him suspect. For over a year, Japanese Americans were barred from military service. Some who had been in our OTC programs were dismissed. Some who had been drafted before Pearl Harbor were discharged. The message was clear: you're not wanted. But behind the barbed wire of the internment camps, something remarkable was happening. Young men were volunteering. When the Army finally announced in early 1943 that it would form an all-Japanese American combat unit, thousands of young men from the camp stepped forward. Think about that. Their families were in prison. Their rights had been stripped away. They lost their homes, their businesses, their freedom, and they were volunteering to fight for the country that had done this. To them, why, the reasons were complicated. Some believed that military service would prove their loyalty and help their families. Some wanted to fight fascism and believed the cause was worth fighting for despite everything. Some were angry and wanted a chance to hit back at somebody, even if it wasn't the people who'd imprisoned them. Some simply believed in America, the idea of America, and wanted to defend it, even when America hadn't defended them. One volunteer from Manzanar, when asked why he was enlisting, said, "I'm not fighting for the government that put my family here. I'm fighting for the country my family believed in." There's a difference. In Hawaii, where young Japanese American men hadn't been imprisoned, the response was overwhelming. When the Army announced it needed 1,500 volunteers from Hawaii, over 10,000 showed up to enlist. They had to turn people away. These men from Hawaii, many of them sons of plantation workers, fishermen, small business owners, had grown up in a different environment than their mainland counterparts. They hadn't faced the same level of discrimination, but they understood what was at stake. They understood that Japanese Americans across the country were being judged, and they wanted to prove something. The unit was designated the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The number had no special significance. It was simply the next available designation in the Army's numbering system. But the men who joined, it would make it legendary. Their motto came from a Hawaiian gambling phrase: go for broke. It meant to risk everything, to bet it all, to hold nothing back. That's exactly what they did. The 442nd trained at Camp Shelby in Mississippi. It was the first time many of the Hawaiian soldiers had been to the mainland. It was the first time most of them had experienced the kind of prejudice that mainland Japanese Americans knew all too well. They weren't allowed at certain restaurants. Some businesses refused to serve them. In nearby towns, local people sometimes mistook them for prisoners of war or enemy soldiers. There were incidents, confrontations. The military police had to intervene more than once. The soldiers from Hawaii and the soldiers from the camps didn't get along at first either. The Hawaiians, who called themselves Buddha heads, thought the mainlanders, who they called Katonks, were too quiet, too passive. The mainlanders thought the Hawaiians were loud and undisciplined. There were fights in the barracks. Then the Hawaiian soldiers were invited to visit some of the camps to see where the mainland soldiers' families were living. They saw the barbed wire, the guard towers, the tar paper barracks. They saw families living behind fences under guard. Because of their ancestry. After that, the fighting stopped. The Hawaiians understood why the mainland soldiers seemed different. The mainlanders understood why the Hawaiians seemed so carefree. They were all in this together. They trained harder than anyone else. They had something to prove, not just to the Army, not just to America, but to themselves. Their officers, most of them white, quickly learned that these soldiers were different. They didn't complain. They didn't quit. They pushed themselves beyond what was asked. According to training reports, the 442nd consistently outperformed other units in physical fitness, marksmanship, and tactical exercises. One officer wrote in his evaluation, "These men are motivated in a way I've never seen before. They're not just trying to be good soldiers, they're trying to be perfect soldiers. It's like they think one mistake will reflect on their entire community." He was right. That's exactly what they thought. Every one of them knew they were representing all Japanese Americans. Every action, every achievement, Every failure would be used to judge their entire community. It was an impossible burden. They carried it anyway. In June 1944, the 442nd shipped out to Italy. They joined the Italian campaign, fighting their way up the peninsula through some of the most difficult terrain in Europe. The mountains, the rivers, the prepared German defensive positions. They took heavy casualties but earned a reputation as fighters, tough, disciplined, fearless. Other units began requesting them for difficult missions. Commanders who had been skeptical at first became believers. At Belvedere, they scaled a mountain that German intelligence had determined was unclimbable. The Germans had left it lightly defended because they thought no one could attack from that direction. The 442nd proved them wrong. They climbed at night, in silence, and hit the Germans from their undefended flank. At Castellina, they broke through German positions they had held for weeks. At Sauceda, they cleared enemy forces from fortified hills overlooking critical supply routes. With each battle, casualties mounted, but replacements kept coming. More volunteers from the camps and from Hawaii. The unit's reputation grew. Japanese American soldiers were fighting and dying to prove their loyalty, while their families remained imprisoned. The irony was lost on no one. By September 1944, the 442nd had been pulled from Italy and sent to France. The Allied advance was pushing toward Germany on multiple fronts. In France, American forces were moving through the Vosges mountains, a range that ran along the border between France and Germany. The Vosges were different from Italy. Dense forests of pine and spruce, steep ridges cut by narrow valleys, cold rain that turned to sleet as autumn advanced toward winter. The Germans had been fortifying positions there for months. They knew the terrain. They had the high ground, and they were determined to hold it. The 442nd was attached to the 36th Infantry Division, known as the Texas Division, because many of its soldiers came from Texas and Oklahoma. The 36th had been fighting since North Africa. They landed at Salerno, fought at Monte Cassino. They were veterans, good soldiers, but the Vosges were grinding them down. The terrain favored defense. Every ridge was a fortress. Every forest path could hide a machine gun nest. The Germans used the terrain perfectly, falling back, drawing the Americans in, then hitting them from concealed positions. The 442nd took their place in the line and began the slow, brutal work of pushing through the mountains. It was yard-by-yard warfare. Advance, take casualties, consolidate, advance again, day after day in cold rain and mud. By late October, the 36th Division had pushed deep into the mountains. One battalion, the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, pushed farther than the others. They were mostly Texas boys, young men from small towns and ranches who'd grown up hunting and fishing. They were good soldiers, tough and determined. The commander was Lieutenant Colonel William Byrd, a West Point graduate who'd been with the battalion since North Africa. He was aggressive, some said too aggressive, but his men trusted him. He believed in leading from the front. On October 24th, the 1st Battalion was ordered to continue its advance. They were ahead of the units on their flanks, but intelligence suggested the Germans were withdrawing. Byrd decided to keep pushing. They advanced through dense forest into a narrow valley. The going was slow. Visibility was limited. They were stretched out in a column, following a logging road that wound through the trees. Then the Germans opened fire. It was a carefully planned ambush. Machine guns from the ridges on both sides, mortars dropping among the trees, artillery falling on the trail behind them, cutting off any retreat. The 1st Battalion had walked into a trap. They tried to fight their way out. They couldn't. The Germans held the high ground on all sides. Byrd ordered his men to form a defensive perimeter on a hillside. Dig in. Hold on. Help was coming. They radioed for help. The division tried to reach them, sent other units to break through, but the German defenses were too strong. Every attack was thrown back with heavy losses. Days passed. The Trap Battalion, which the press would soon call the Lost Battalion, echoing a famous World War I unit, dug in deeper. They were running low on ammunition, low on food. They had wounded men who needed medical evacuation. The Germans attacked repeatedly, trying to overrun them. Each attack was beaten back, but each attack cost more casualties and more precious ammunition. The men rationed what little food they had, shared canteens, collected rainwater in helmets. The wounded lay in foxholes, attended by medics who had run out of morphine and most of their bandages. The nights were cold. The days brought more shelling and more attacks. Lieutenant Colonel Byrd sent increasingly desperate radio messages. They needed supplies. They needed water. They needed help. The division headquarters sent supply planes, but the forest was too dense. Pilots couldn't see the ground clearly. Supplies drifted into German lines or hung up in trees. One ammunition drop landed right in the middle of the battalion's position, killing several men and wounding others. The survivors would later talk about the sounds. The German machine guns a faster rate of fire than American guns, distinctive and terrifying. The mortars whizzing down through the trees, the screams of wounded men, the silence in between. When you could hear the wind in the pines and wonder if the next shell had your name on it. By October 27th, the situation was critical. The trapped soldiers were down to their last ammunition. Some men were literally counting bullets. They were drinking rainwater collected in helmets, sharing it with the wounded. The wounded were suffering without proper medical care. Infections were setting in. Some men had been killed by German shelling, others by German snipers who had infiltrated close to the perimeter. More than 270 men had entered the forest. Now dozens were dead or dying. The rest were exhausted, hungry, and running out of hope. Back at division headquarters, the generals faced a terrible decision. They could keep trying to break through with fresh units, but every attempt had failed, and the casualties were mounting. The division was being bled white trying to reach one trapped battalion. Or they could write off the Lost Battalion as lost and save the rest of their forces. There was a third option. They could send in the 442nd. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team had been fighting in the Vosges for weeks. They were tired. They'd taken casualties. Some companies were already under strength, but they had a reputation for getting the job done, for never quitting, for accomplishing missions that other units couldn't. On October 26th, the regimental commander, Colonel Charles Pence, received the order from Major General John Dahlquist, commander of the 36th Division, break through to the Lost Battalion, bring them out. Pence studied the maps. He knew the terrain. He knew the German defenses. He knew that other units had tried and failed. He also knew what this mission would cost his regiment. But orders were orders, and there were over 100 American soldiers trapped in those woods. They needed help. The 442nd would provide it. Pence briefed his battalion commanders. They briefed their company commanders. The company commanders briefed their platoon leaders. The word spread through the regiment. The men of the 442nd knew what they were being asked to do. Other units, good units, veteran units had tried and failed. The terrain was brutal. The Germans were dug in. This wasn't going to be a quick rescue. This was going to be a fight. Daniel Inouye, now a lieutenant leading a platoon in the regiment, later recalled the moment they received the mission. There was no cheering, no bravado, just quiet determination. They had a job to do. Men were counting on them. That was enough. But the soldiers wrote letters home that night, just in case. They didn't say much. Told their families they loved them. Told them not to worry. Told them they'd write again soon. Many of those letters would never be sent. On the morning of October 27th, the 442nd moved into position. The plan was straightforward. Punch through the German lines along the ridge, reach the trapped battalion, and hold the corridor open for evacuation. Straightforward on paper. In reality, it meant attacking uphill through dense forest against an enemy that knew every inch of the ground. It meant advancing through machine gun fire and artillery. It meant taking casualties and keeping going. The attack began at 0800 hours. The first day, they advanced 200 yards through hell. The forest was so thick that visibility was measured in feet, not yards. Trees grew close together, their branches intertwined overhead, blocking out most of the light even at midday. The ground was covered in pine needles and moss, wet from days of rain. Every step was treacherous. Men slipped on the slick ground, caught their feet on roots, stumbled over rocks hidden by undergrowth, and everywhere. The Germans were waiting. The German defenders had spent weeks preparing these positions. They knew where the Americans would have to advance. They'd sighted their machine guns for interlocking fields of fire. They pre-registered their mortars and artillery on likely approach routes. They dug trenches and bunkers and camouflaged them perfectly. They were dug in, warmed, fed, and supplied, and they had orders to hold at all costs. When the 442nd attacked, the Germans opened fire. Trees splintered from machine gun fire. Mortars burst in the canopy, sending shrapnel, and with splinters down on the advancing soldiers. The sound was overwhelming: the crack of rifles, the chatter of machine guns, the crump of mortars, the whistle of artillery, men shouting orders, men screaming for medics. The ground was steep. Muddy, covered in roots and rocks, men slipped and fell, got up, kept moving. Some didn't get up. German positions were everywhere. A machine gun would open up from a concealed bunker. The lead squad would take casualties. Men would drop, hit, or diving for cover. The rest would maneuver, some laying down suppressing fire, while others flanked. They'd knock out the position, move forward, hit the next one. It was slow, exhausting, deadly. Squads that started the day with 9 or 10 men were down to 6 or 7 by noon, down to 4 or 5 by evening. Replacements moved up from the rear, plugging holes in the line. Medics worked frantically, treating wounds under fire, calling for litter bearers to evacuate the seriously wounded. By nightfall on the first day, the 442nd had advanced only a few hundred yards. They'd suffered dozens of casualties, but they hadn't stopped. They dug in for the night, ate cold rations, tried to rest. Some men slept despite the cold and wet. Others lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The next day, they attacked again, and the day after that. The Germans knew what the Americans were trying to do. They reinforced their positions, brought in more troops from other sectors. They were determined to stop this rescue attempt like they'd stopped all the others. But the 442nd kept coming. On the second day, October 28th, the regiment focused on a ridge that dominated the approach to the Lost Battalion. If they could take the ridge, they could push down the other side toward the trapped men. But the ridge was heavily fortified. The Germans had dug trenches along the crest and positioned machine guns to cover every approach. The attack went in. At dawn, companies moved up the slope in bounds, one squad moving while another provided covering fire. The Germans poured fire down on them. Men fell. The attack stalled. Officers and sergeants pushed their men forward. Keep moving. Don't stop. Technical Sergeant Abraham Ohama, a squad leader from Hawaii, saw his platoon pinned down by machine gun fire. He grabbed a Browning automatic rifle from a wounded soldier and charged the German position alone. He killed the machine gun crew and held the position until his squad could reach him. He was wounded twice but refused evacuation. The ridge was taken by midday, but the cost was high. One company had lost over 40 men. Another had lost all of its officers and was being led by a sergeant. From the ridge, they could see the valley where the Lost Battalion was trapped, so close, maybe a mile, maybe less. But that mile was filled with more German positions, more machine guns, more mortars, more men who would kill them if they could. They kept going. On October 29th, the third day of the attack, the 442nd was grinding forward yard by yard. The Germans contested every foot. They would fall back from one position, let the Americans advance, then hit them from another prepared position. The forest became a nightmare landscape. Trees shattered by shell fire, craters from mortars, bodies American and German lying where they'd fallen, the smell of credite and blood and pine sap, the wounded calling for help, the constant fear that the next bullet or shell had your name on it. But there's a moment in battle when exhaustion and fear become so overwhelming that the only thing keeping you going is the man next to you. That's where the 442nd lived for 5 days. They fought not just for the Lost Battalion. They fought for each other, because that's what you do. Because the man next to you is depending on you. Because if you stop, if you quit, he dies. Individual acts of courage became routine. A squad would be pinned down by a machine gun. One man would volunteer to flank it. Sometimes he made it. Sometimes he didn't. Either way, the squad kept moving. Private First Class Sadao Munamori was from Los Angeles. His family was in the internment camp at Manzanar. His mother, his siblings, behind barbed wire while he fought in France. On October 29th, his squad was pinned down by German fire near a fortified house. Munamori crawled forward with a demolition charge, destroyed the position, and allowed his squad to advance hours later. Advancing through the same area, a German grenade landed among his men. Munamori saw it. He could have jumped away, could have taken cover. Instead, he threw himself on it. The explosion killed him instantly. The 2 soldiers next to him were knocked down by the blast but survived. Munamori was 22 years old. He'd been in combat for less than 6 months. The regiment didn't stop to mourn. They couldn't. The Lost Battalion was still out there, still waiting, still hoping. By October 30th, the 442nd had fought to within a few hundred yards of the trapped unit. They could hear American voices calling out, men shouting questions. Are you Texans? Where are you from? So close. Close enough to hear, but not close enough to see through the dense forest. But those last few hundred yards were the most heavily defended of all. The Germans knew that if the rescue succeeded, they'd lose their prize. They'd also lose face. An entire battalion of Americans held for nearly a week, only to be rescued at the last moment. They couldn't allow it. They poured fire into the advancing Japanese-American soldiers, machine guns, mortars, even some direct fire artillery. The casualties mounted. Men fell faster than they could be evacuated. 8 stations were overwhelmed. Medics moved through the combat zone, treating wounded under fire, saving lives while risking their own. The fighting became hand-to-hand in some places, bayonets, grenades at close range. Men too tired to feel fear anymore, just doing what needed to be done, just trying to survive the next 5 minutes. Then the 5 minutes after that, Lieutenant Daniel Inouye's platoon was among the lead elements. Years later, he described those final yards as the longest of his life. Every tree could hide an enemy soldier. Every step could be your last. But they kept going because men were counting on them, because quitting wasn't an option, because they'd come too far to stop now. On the afternoon of October 30th, 5 days after the rescue mission began, the first soldiers of the 442nd reached the perimeter of the Lost Battalion. Private Masaku Moto from Hawaii was among the first to make contact. He crawled through the underbrush, heard American voices, called out in English, "Hey, Texas, where are you?" A voice came back, suspicious, cautious. "Who's asking? For 42nd or CT? We're here to get you out." There was a pause, then, about damn time, within minutes, more soldiers from the 442nd reached the perimeter. They linked up with the defenders, formed a continuous line, began organizing the evacuation. The trapped soldiers, filthy, exhausted, some barely able to stand, stared at their rescuers. Many had heard that a Japanese-American unit was coming. For them, some had been skeptical. Some hadn't cared who came as long as someone came. What they saw were American soldiers who looked as exhausted as they felt. Soldiers who had just fought through 5 days of hell to reach them. The soldiers of the Lost Battalion were in rough shape. They hadn't eaten a proper meal in a week. They'd been drinking rainwater. The wounded had been lying in muddy foxholes for days, their bandages filthy, infection spreading. Some men could barely walk. Others had to be carried. The 442nd medics went to work immediately, treating wounds, handing out food and water, preparing the wounded for evacuation. It would take hours to get everyone out, and the Germans were still shelling the area. They had to move fast. One soldier from the Lost Battalion, a young private from Texas, looked at an SA soldier who was handing him a canteen and asked, "What took you so long?" The response was simple: "We had to fight our way here." Another soldier, an older sergeant who'd been wounded in the leg, said to one of the rescuers, "I heard your people were locked up back home. Why'd you come?" Then the SA soldier, Private Shiro Kashino from Seattle, looked at him and said, "Same reason you were here, orders, and because you're Americans, same as us." The evacuation began immediately. Walking wounded helped those who couldn't walk. Litter bearers carried the seriously wounded. The 442nd formed a protective corridor, holding off German counterattacks while the evacuation proceeded. It took until after dark to get everyone out. Every minute, there was German fire, shells falling, snipers taking shots, but the 442nd held the line. They'd come to bring these men home, and they weren't leaving until every last one was out. Of the 275 men who'd been trapped, 211 were rescued. The rest had been killed or died of wounds during the siege. Every survivor owed his life to the men of the 442nd, but the cost was staggering. In 5 days of combat, from October 27th to October 30th, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team suffered over 800 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, more than 3 times the number of men they'd rescued. Some companies had been reduced to the size of platoons, fewer than 30 men out of a normal strength of nearly 200. Some platoons were down to a handful of men. The 2nd Battalion alone lost over 400 men. Entire squads had been wiped out. Platoons had lost all their officers and senior sergeants. Companies were being commanded by lieutenants who'd been platoon leaders days before. Platoons were being led by sergeants or even corporals. The medics had worked around the clock, treating hundreds of wounded. The 8 stations were overwhelmed. Surgeons operated by lamplight in tents, performing emergency surgery to save lives. sending the stabilized wounded back to rear hospitals. The 442nd had accomplished their mission. They'd done what they were asked to do. They brought their fellow soldiers home, but they'd been torn apart doing it. After the rescue, the 442nd was pulled back from the line for rest and refitting. They lost too many men. To continue operations immediately, they needed replacements. They needed rest. They needed time to absorb what they'd been through. The survivors didn't talk much about it at first. That wasn't their way. They'd done their job. That was enough. But in quiet moments, in letters home, in conversations with each other, the weight of it began to settle in. 800 casualties to save 211 men. From a purely military standpoint, it was a terrible exchange rate. You don't trade for men to save one. It doesn't make sense. The arithmetic is brutal and clear, but there's arithmetic. And then there's duty. There's calculation, and then there's commitment. The 442nd had been given a mission: bring those men home. They'd done it. The cost didn't change the necessity. The casualties didn't change the commitment. Replacements arrived. Within days, more Japanese-American volunteers from the camps and from Hawaii. Young men eager to join the regiment that had become famous. They joined a unit that had been bloodied but not broken, that had been hurt but not defeated. The veterans, the men who'd been through the Vosges, trained the new arrivals, taught them how to survive, taught them the lessons learned in blood, and slowly, the regiment rebuilt itself. Word of the rescue spread quickly. Correspondents who'd been covering the 3rd to 6th Division filed stories. Newspapers across America picked them up. Americans read about these Japanese-American soldiers who'd suffered terrible casualties. The save trapped Texas boys. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Men whose families were imprisoned had fought and died to save the sons of the people who had supported that imprisonment. Soldiers who'd been called enemy aliens had proven their loyalty in the most brutal way possible. The response back home was mixed. Some Americans were moved by the story, began questioning whether the internment was just, began seeing Japanese Americans as fellow Americans rather than potential enemies. Others dismissed it, said the NSA soldiers were just following orders, said they were trying to prove something and got more men killed than they saved, said it didn't change anything about the need for internment. But in the camps, behind the barbed wire, the families of the 442nd soldiers knew what it meant. Their sons and brothers and fathers had done something extraordinary, had proven something that shouldn't have needed proving, had paid a price that was almost unbearable. When families received the telegrams, "We regret to inform you," they grieved behind barbed wire. They held memorial services in mess halls. They buried their grief alongside their anger and their pride. The 442nd went on to become the most decorated unit of its size in American military history. 21 Medals of Honor, though most weren't awarded until decades after the war. 9,500 Purple Hearts, meaning many men were wounded multiple times. Over 18,000 individual decorations. 7 presidential uni citations. They fought through France, back into Italy, helped liberate towns, and were among the units that eventually broke through the Gothic line and pushed into northern Italy. They fought until the war in Europe ended. In May 1940-5. Throughout it all, the Vosges rescue remained their defining moment. The mission that showed what they were willing to sacrifice. The mission that demonstrated, once and for all, that Japanese Americans were Americans, period. But the cost of that proof haunted them in later years. Survivors would say they were proud of what they'd done, proud of bringing those men home. But the pride was always mixed with grief. 800 casualties, 800 brothers who'd been killed or wounded, 800 families who received telegrams, 800 empty places at tables back home. Daniel Inouye survived the Vosges. He survived the war, though he lost his arm in combat in Italy in April 1945. Just weeks before the war ended, he was attacking a German machine gun position when he was hit by a grenade that nearly tore his arm off. He continued fighting, throwing grenades with his remaining hand until he was hit again and collapsed. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for that action. 55 years later, in 2000, it was upgraded to the Medal of Honor. By then, he was a United States Senator representing Hawaii. He served in the Senate for decades, becoming one of the most respected members of Congress. But he rarely talked about his service. When he did, he always came back to the same themes. They fought to prove they were Americans. They shouldn't have had to prove it, but they did, and they paid a terrible price for that proof. In interviews, Late in his life, Inoue would say, "We weren't heroes, we were just soldiers doing our job. The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home." Private First Class Sadao Munemori, who'd thrown himself on a grenade to save his squad on October 29th, was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. In March 2055 years after his death, that award was upgraded to the Medal of Honor as part of a review of decorations given to Asian American soldiers who might have been passed over due to discrimination. When his family received the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House, his sister, who'd been a young girl when he died, said, "He did what he thought was right. He did what he was trained to do. He saved his friends. That's who my brother was." The Munemori family had spent the war at Manzanar internment camp. They learned of Sadao's death while still behind barbed wire. They held a memorial service in the camp. They grieved surrounded by fences and guard towers. The Medal of Honor ceremony, 55 years later, was a form of closure. But it didn't bring him back. The soldiers of the Lost Battalion never forgot who rescued them. Many of them wrote letters after the war, tracking down the men of the 442nd to thank them. Some of those letters took months or years to arrive, finding Japanese American soldiers who'd scattered across the country. After the war wasn't easy, but they kept trying. One soldier from Texas, who'd been wounded during the siege and evacuated by 442nd medics, spent years looking for the Nisei soldier who carried him to the aid station. He finally found him in California. In the 1960s, they became friends, visited each other, corresponded until one of them died, another soldier, a lieutenant who'd been one of the last officers alive in the Lost Battalion, made it his mission to attend 442nd reunions. He'd show up, often the only non-Nisei person there, and thank them every year until he couldn't travel anymore. These connections, these bonds forged in the Vosges lasted lifetimes. The men of the Lost Battalion understood what the 442nd had sacrificed for them, and they spent the rest of their lives trying to express their gratitude. In 2000, the government of the United States formally apologized for the internment of Japanese Americans. During World War II, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 had already provided reparations $20,000 to each survivor of the camps, but the year 2000 apology was more comprehensive. Acknowledging the full scope of the injustice, President Bill Clinton, in a statement, said, "Over 50 years ago, the United States government unjustly interned, evacuated, or relocated you and many other Japanese Americans. Today, on behalf of your fellow Americans, I offer a sincere apology to you for the actions that unfairly denied Japanese Americans and their families fundamental liberties during World War II. For the survivors of the camps and for the veterans of the 442nd, the apology was important, but it couldn't give back what had been taken, couldn't restore the years behind barbed wire, couldn't bring back the men who died proving their loyalty. Still, it was acknowledgement. It was the country saying, we were wrong, you were loyal, you were Americans, you always were." The 442nd Regimental Combat Team received numerous honors after the war. Presidential Uni citations, the highest honor a unit can receive, a place in the Military Intelligence Service Hall of Fame, induction into the Ranger Hall of Fame, recognition as the most decorated unit of its size in U.S. military history. In 2011, the Congressional Gold Medal was awarded, collectively, to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the Military Intelligence Service. It was presented in a ceremony at the Capitol. Surviving veterans, now in their 80s and 90s, attended, many in wheelchairs, some with family members who traveled from across the country to be there. Senator Daniel Inouye, who'd lost his arm in combat with the 442nd, gave a speech. He was 86 years old. He talked about his fellow soldiers, about the men who didn't come home, about what they'd fought for and what they'd proven. "We were American soldiers," he said. "We just wanted to serve our country. We wanted to show that we were loyal. We wanted to come home with honor. Many of us didn't come home at all. Today, there are monuments to the 442nd across America, in Hawaii, where so many of them came from, in California, near the sites of former internment camps, at the National World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., where their story is told alongside those of all who served in the Vosges Mountains of France. There are markers, signs that tell the story of what happened there in October 1944, where the Lost Battalion was trapped, where the 442nd broke through, where over 800 men were killed or wounded in 5 days of fighting. The forests have grown back, the trenches and foxholes have filled in, the forest floor has covered the scars, but the memory remains. Schools and buildings bear the name of the 442nd. Their story is taught in history classes. Books and documentaries tell their tale. Each generation learns anew about these soldiers who fought for a country that had imprisoned their families. But perhaps the most fitting memorial is simpler. At reunions of the 442nd held annually for decades, until the last veterans grew too old to attend, they would gather in hotel ballrooms or community centers. Graying men, then elderly men, then very old men. Fewer each year, they would eat together, share stories, remember the men who weren't there, and at some point, someone would stand and recite their motto, "Go for broke," and the others would respond, "Go for broke." It was a ritual, a remembrance, a way of saying, we did it. We bet everything, we risked it all, and we proved what we came to prove. Then they would raise their glasses to the absent friends, the men who didn't come home, the men who paid the ultimate price. The last official reunion was held in 2012. Only a handful of veterans could attend. They were in their late 80s and 90s. Time was running out, but they came. They gathered one more time. They remembered, and they recited their motto, "Go for broke." The Vosges mountains are quiet now. The forests grow thick and green. Hikers walk trails where men fought and died. Few know the full story of what happened there in October 1944. The markers tell part of it, but markers can't convey the full weight of what happened. The fear, the cold, the exhaustion, the price. But we should know. We should remember. We should remember that over 200 men were trapped behind enemy lines, that they held on, hoping for rescue, that multiple units tried to reach them and failed. We should remember that the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was given the mission, that they fought for 5 days through brutal terrain and determined German resistance, that they suffered over 800 casualties, more than 3 times the number of men they rescued. We should remember that these soldiers were Japanese Americans, that their families were in internment camps, that they'd been called enemy aliens and security risks, that they had to prove their loyalty when their loyalty should never have been questioned. We should remember that they did prove it in blood, in sacrifice, in courage that went beyond what should ever be asked of anyone. The men of the 442nd went for broke in the Vosges mountains. They bet everything. They risked it all, and they won something more valuable than any military objective. They won recognition. They won respect. They won the right to be seen as what they'd always been, Americans. But the cost was 800 casualties, 800 men killed, wounded, or missing, 800 families who received telegrams, 800 lives forever changed. Was it worth it? That's a question the survivors struggled with for the rest of their lives. They were proud of what they accomplished, proud of bringing the Lost Battalion home, proud of proving their loyalty and their courage, but they grieved for the price. They grieved for the friends who didn't come home. They grieved for the necessity of having to prove something. That should have been assumed in a just world. They wouldn't have had to prove anything. In a just world, their families wouldn't have been in camps. In a just world, they would have been recognized as Americans from the start. But the world isn't always just, and sometimes good people have to pay a terrible price to make it a little more just. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team paid the price in the Vosges Mountains in October 1944, and in paying it, they changed America. They forced the country to see Japanese Americans differently. They made it harder to justify the internment camps. They proved that loyalty and patriotism aren't determined by ancestry or the color of your skin. They shouldn't have had to prove it, but they did, and we owe them our remembrance. We owe them our gratitude. We owe them the commitment to build an America worthy of their sacrifice, an America where loyalty is assumed, not questioned, where sacrifice is honored, not ignored, where being American means being treated as American regardless of who you are or where your family came from. That's what they fought for. That's what they bled for. That's what 800 of them were killed or wounded for. And that's what we owe them, not just memorials and medals, though those matter, but the living reality of the America they believed in, the America they fought to defend, the America they thought they were proving they belonged to. They always belonged. They just had to convince the country of it, and they did. In the forests of the Vosges, in 5 days of brutal combat, at a cost that still echoes down through the decades. Go for broke. They risked everything, and they won. Not just the battle, not just the rescue, but something larger, something more important. They won the right to be remembered as American heroes, because that's what they were. That's what they always were. Asterisk.